All right, verse 1. It says, "In the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, with the train of his robe filling the temple. Seraphim stood above him, each having 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called out to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is Yahweh of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." That's where we get the song from that verse. "And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called out, while the house of God was filling with smoke. Then I said, Woe is me, for I am ruined. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, Yahweh of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a burning coal in his hand, which he had taken from the altar with tongs, and he touched my mouth with it and said, Behold, this has touched your lips, and your iniquity is taken away, and your sin is atoned for. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, Here am I, send me. He said, Go and tell this people, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not know. Render the hearts of this people insensitive, their ears dull, and their eyes dim, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and return and be healed." Well, as I've said, this is one of the more notable passages. This is the famous vision passage. Now, we went through Isaiah some time ago, and I, of course, touched on this. But I didn't make it the focus, of course. But okay, let's set the background of this. Now, King Uzziah, it says, this was in the year, the vision that Isaiah saw was in the year of King Uzziah's death. Now, exactly which time in this year, did he die before? Did he die afterwards? Probably he died before. I mean, that would make it more notable. But nevertheless, the point is going to be the same. But so, in case we don't remember, King Uzziah was one of the more righteous kings that they had. King Uzziah had a very successful career as a king until the very end. I think it was just a couple sermons ago I've talked about this. But so King Uzziah was a very righteous king, and he because of his zeal for God, he had a lot of great stuff done for the kingdom. I mean, he did a lot of things for their economy, especially for their military force and defending them. I mean, and just if you go and you read about King Uzziah, you read about a lot of very successful tasks that he got done. And the problem with King Uzziah, though, is he became very aware of his own accomplishments, perhaps, and his own righteousness. It says that his heart became lifted up. So if you read the story in Chronicles, but if you read the story, it says his heart was lifted up. In other words, he became a little too aware of how good he was doing, and that he was a very righteous king, and very righteous as a king for Yahweh. And it says that he went into the temple, of course, and that he offered incense, which only the priests were to do. And of course, he knew that. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't qualified. So God had said only certain people, the Levites, the family of Aaron, could offer incense. And they said, in fact, the priests came in to withstand him, and they said, God has not sanctified you to do this. But he did it anyway. So anyway, if you don't know the story, God struck him with leprosy. He spent the rest of his days, he would have had a proxy king. So he spent the rest of his days in isolation, really, by himself as a leper. Horrible disease. And then he died. So that was his ending. I had a very successful kingdom, and a very successful career as a king, but he was there for a long time and eventually died. So if you, and the more I say this, the more I do remember saying these kinds of things recently, but you have to remember that when you have a nation that has a leader for a very long time, and then he dies, the whole stability of your life and your circumstances and of your country, of your living circumstances, is all kind of up in the air. because you don't know, first of all, what's going to happen. You have to imagine, you have to put yourself in Israel. Now, to get modern application from this, which we're going to do, you just have to set yourself in Israel's place, see what they're seeing. But here's this little nation, and of course, it's a split nation. You got Judah here. The person that has led your country for a long time and been pretty successful and against foreign policy has just died. So you don't know who's coming in, or they might know, or they might not know. You never know who's going to be fighting for the throne. They've had unrighteous kings. The northern kingdom has had nothing but evil kings for the most part. Southern kingdom, you had some good ones. But now that your leader is dead, and you get all these, see, Israel was always surrounded by nations that hated them, kind of like they are now. Now, it's not the same Israel, but as much as they are, they're surrounded by nations that hate them. If they didn't have America in their corner, boy, it'd be really dire straits over there. And almost is anyway. So they're surrounded by people that hate them. And you see what's going on over there right now even. But nevertheless, so the Jewish people then, when the person who has been protecting you is gone, that's always a moment. First of all, when your leader's dead, even if you get a new king right away, you know that your enemies are saying, this is the moment. This is the moment to pounce. And then, even then, you don't know what kind of deals the new leader is going to be making. In the next chapter, chapter 7 of Isaiah, we see that the new king is looking to make a deal with nations that he shouldn't. And they're not actually putting their trust in God, and God is telling them this in the next chapter. And that the deals that they're making just aren't going to work. You know why? Because God is going to judge them. So they're putting their trust in the wrong people, and the wrong friends, and the wrong allies. They need to make God their ally. So you get that from the next chapter, that when Isaiah goes to tell the king. But nevertheless, so a lot is up in the air. Your economy, the foreign issues you have. And especially, we don't feel this so much. But when you're Israel or Judah, you know that people want to destroy you quite often, quite all the time. So that's always on the brink. Is that going to happen? Are we going to be invaded? So your whole living circumstances now are kind of up in the air. And so there's always this uneasy feeling. And so I think that's the point of saying, in the year of King Uzziah's death, that sets up the point here. Now, what he says is, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne. But you know what the point of it is Isaiah, he sees this vision. He says, oh, no, the king isn't dead. The real king is not dead. The king is still sitting on the throne. In other words, yeah, the country has an uneasy feeling because they're not really trusting in the real king. But Isaiah sees very clearly in this moment, no, the real king is still there, and he's still very much in charge. The very one that Israel was not actually putting their trust in. The one that the upcoming king was not going to be putting his trust in. And that the country as a whole was not really following and seeking for. Isaiah says, hey, you know what? Your King Uzziah may be dead, but no, the king's on his throne. That's what he says. He says, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne. So what Isaiah has here is a vision, symbolic. He could have been in the temple. It talks about him being in the temple. He could have very well have been in the temple. But the things he sees, God doesn't literally wear a robe and all that. Doesn't even literally sit on a throne. Why would he need to sit on a throne? But this is all symbolic and making the point. To see the Lord sitting on a throne, the impression is God still reigns in his position over Israel as a king. The kings that were set up in Israel were just representatives. They were supposed to enact what God is to be doing as king, or to enact what God would want the king kingdom, His kingdom to be doing. They're supposed to lead His people the way that the king's king, which is God, would have it be done. And often that wasn't the case. He says, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne high and lifted up. The imagery is of a king being exalted, high and lifted up. It's a mighty king and all His royalty, all of His power and authority, with the train of His robe filling the temple. A king's robe gave the impression, it was always symbolic in these days, of his glory. The big flowing robe, the brighter it is, the more colorful it is, and the more it flowed, the more it spoke of his royalty. And I've used the modern illustration of a bride on her wedding day, with the big wedding dress, and sometimes they have the robe that flows way back, and it's a representative of the glory of the bride, and that's what it was for kings. So he's seeing this vision, and the whole point of it is to impress God's glory. And you have these seraphims. It says they were covering their face, as if to say, the idea is God is so glorious that we dare not look upon Him. That's the idea. You ever notice that too? It's the same idea of, you see this in movies, of course, because we don't have kings, but when people would speak to the king, they would speak in third person. What would the king have me do when they're speaking to the king? And if you ever stop and wonder why they do that, well, it's they have the same concept in Spanish, by the way. You speak in more respectful language. You speak like in third person. But the idea is, I show so much respect for who I'm speaking to that I don't speak to him directly. I'm not that familiar. I'm not that close to the king. I speak as if he's third person. That distances you. That shows honor and respect. It's not what would you have me, but what would the king have me do? It's this respect and glory. So he's covering his face. He's covering his feet. I believe feet represents your creatureliness. Creatures have feet. The people that were created, not God, of course. And then he flew. It says one called out, "Holy, holy, holy." Now, I've said this many times, but in Hebrew, emphasis is done through repetition. We have this all throughout the Bible. Jesus would say, "Verily, verily," depending on your translation, or "Truly, truly." That's Hebrewism or Hebraism. Moses, Moses. Remember when God or Jesus spoke to Saul on the road to Damascus? "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute?" It's all throughout the Bible. In Genesis, when God promises death upon eating the forbidden fruit, He says, you don't see this so much in English, but in the Hebrew it says, "In dying you will die." That's a form of emphasis. So that's the way it happens. And it's also the same principle behind parallelism. Parallelism throughout Scripture, which we've talked about. But here it's repeated 3 times. It's the only attribute of God to be repeated 3 times. Holy, holy, holy. I mean, He's really holy. That's the idea. Holy means to be sanctified, to be set apart. The whole earth is full of His glory. The whole point of the vision is to show that there is a mighty king still reigning. Whatever may be happening, He is full of glory. He reigns. And then it says the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of Him who called out, while the house of God, that's the temple, was filling with smoke. And then Isaiah even says, "Woe is me, for I am ruined. I am a man of unclean lips." Now, when you're standing in the presence of God, suddenly self-confidence takes a nosedive. You ever notice that in the Bible? You remember we talked about Peter and Luke? He was very confident about being a fisherman. Jesus said, "Throw your net over." And then once what happened. We spoke about that recently. Peter threw himself on the ground. "Get away from me, I am a sinner." When you're in the presence of God and His glory, there isn't any confidence, there isn't any self-confidence or arrogance. You're very humbled. That's what this Isaiah here. Compared to other people, he was a very righteous man and he was a prophet. But all of a sudden, in the presence of God, he said, "You know what? I'm not so righteous. My words aren't as good as they should be. I'm a man of unclean lips, like everybody else. It says, among a people of unclean lips. You know, he says, all of a sudden, I'm not so better than anybody else. That's the idea. This is his vision of God and his glory. We'll have more to say about the rest of what we read here in a little bit. But this is the idea. This is the main idea, I believe, of the vision, is to see that God still reigns. Now, that has very much application to us, especially at this time, in this nation, in an election year. And there's a lot of stuff going on about these kinds of things. So, you know, we live in an election year, and as far as how the government will go, I believe, and this is what I've talked about on my program recently, there has to be a fair and balanced look at elections, who's running for president, who's going for president. And by fair and balanced, I mean biblical, because biblical perspectives are fair and balanced because they are truth. Now, I never talk about who to vote for, political parties. That's not what I do. But the things that I hear from so many people, I think there needs to be a biblical perspective. But primarily I want to say this. Biblically speaking, which means reality, is that regardless of who gets put in the White House, there is still a king who sits on the throne, by far. And that's Jesus Christ. He's the king. And he is the one who reigns. You know, he's our king now. I mean, in the sense that God has always been king. His universal rule, of course, he's still king. But Jesus Christ came. Jesus Christ came over 2,000 years ago, and he invaded this world, and he set up a kingdom. And it has been spreading ever since. In fact, let's be clear on that. You know, there's actually a pretty interesting connection before I go on with my point. Of course, this is the point, that we do have a king, and he is the one that sits on the throne. There is still a king on the throne. You know, Isaiah 6 is mentioned in the New Testament, very notably in John chapter 12. And I know, by the way, the camera won't see the stuff. It's too bright for it. But that's okay, because I'll be reading it. In John chapter 12, Jesus has been speaking. Some Greeks came, and they wanted to speak to him. But beginning in verse 37, it says, "But though he had done so many signs before them, they still were not believing in him." No surprise there. "So that the word of Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spoke. Lord, who has believed our report? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?" Now that's not Isaiah 6. But then he says, "For this reason they could not believe, for Isaiah said again," now this is, "He has blinded their eyes, and he has hardened their heart, lest they see with their eyes, and understand with their heart, and return, and I heal them." That is Isaiah 6. We read that part. These things Isaiah said because he saw his glory and he spoke about him. Now that's an interesting statement. It said he saw his glory. Isaiah, says John, saw his glory. Well, who's he talking about? But you know, Isaiah 6 is the famous glory passage. You know, I emphasized as we were reading it all the statements about glory. Holy, 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 and the glory of his robe, and the high and exalted. It is the emphasis in Isaiah 6 is the glory of God. And this is Yahweh. It mentions Yahweh in the passage, in the chapter, which every Israelite and every Jew knew was about the one true God of Israel. But the thing is, John says Isaiah saw Jesus' glory. Actually sees Jesus. Jesus has always been the Word and the representative of God. We know that even in John chapter 1, when it says, in verse 18, it says, no one has seen God at any time. The only begotten God, and we won't focus on that little statement there. Your Bible may say something different. Who is in the bosom of the Father, He has explained Him. It's talking about Jesus, of course. So no man has seen God at any time. Jesus has always been the spokesman and the representative and the one who communicates God. But in John chapter 12, it says, Isaiah saw Jesus' glory. Saw His glory. And actually, it's very interesting because in Isaiah chapter 6, now we're reading a translation of the Hebrew. All the New Testament writers were familiar primarily quoted from the Septuagint. That is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament scriptures. So most of the time when they quote in the New Testament from the Old Testament, they're quoting a Greek translation. That's very easy to tell because they word it according to the Greek, not the Hebrew, when there's a notable difference. Just like different English translations, you can recognize when you read the King James, if you're reading a quote, as opposed to some of the translation, you just recognize it, you see. But it's interesting that in the Septuagint, it just mentions glory, that the Lord is sitting on a throne, and Isaiah says the whole, the temple was full of His glory, which is basically the statement in John. He says he saw Jesus' glory, which I believe is an allusion. Now he quotes from Isaiah 6, but then I believe that statement is a direct connection to Isaiah 6. I mean, we know that it is anyway because it says he saw His glory. This is the glory passage. We're speaking about Jesus. But very much so in our time, Jesus is the one who's king. When Jesus, before He ascended, He said, I have been given all authority in heaven and on earth. You know what that means? It means He's king. Of course, this is every sermon, every speech, everything that Jesus talked about centered on the kingdom this, the kingdom that. Now we got a religious mentality today that the kingdom was postponed. Well, I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but it's just amazing that people can think that God had a plan and it was thwarted, and then He had to postpone it, like He didn't see what was coming to come. No, He had a plan to set up His king, and that's exactly what He did. He set up His kingdom on His throne. That's what it says in Acts chapter 2. Paul says we've been transferred into the kingdom, but we know this. But Jesus is the king. And there's still a king on the throne. So, as it goes by every 4 years, this is all we hear about and all we talk about. And I'm not saying it's not significant or important or that you shouldn't pay attention to it. I pay attention to it. I mean, I'm very interested in the elections. But I believe people, and a lot of Christians, put too much expectation and hope in who goes into the White House. Now, I want to be very clear, though, what I'm saying. I'm not saying it doesn't matter or that it doesn't affect us who gets into the White House. I have my preferences. I mean, between the two people running now, and one of them may change, I don't know. I have my preference. We all know who that is, of who I think is better for the Christian purpose in this country. And it's Donald Trump. But, so I think there can be an exalted perception of what kind of long-term abiding influence these presidents can have. So I'm not saying you shouldn't have a preference or be interested. I'm saying, but remember that the real king is Jesus Christ. And that there's only so much that a human is going to do in these political offices. You know, because it's always been this way. You know, Ronald Reagan was a very conservative president. He came in, and then he left. And then other people that were opposite of him came in, and that goes by, and then here we are again. We need to get a conservative in. And I believe, yeah, we do. I absolutely do. And I hope that happens. But if it does, you just got to remember, it doesn't take much for some other person to come in later and just, there we are again, back in the same spot. There's only so much they can do. Because ultimately, it matters who's really on the throne and not who's in the White House. Ultimately. It does, we are affected by what government people do. We are affected by elections. And so I'm not telling you that it doesn't matter at all, so I'll make sure that you understand what I'm saying. But, you know, in this recent thing, I have to say, because so many people are now saying in the media. And we, as Christians, want to communicate the mind of God on these matters. So this is what my recent programs are about. Do I hope that Donald Trump, between the two people, get in? Yeah, I do. I really do. Because I think he's better for our purposes and religious freedom and many other things. But, my expectations are limited. And they're limited by reality. And the reality is that Jesus Christ is what matters. The Christian message. The best you could do for this country is the gospel and saving souls. But so, because of this recent assassination attempt, all these things that are being said, this is what I said in my program. We can be certain of this, that if God did not want Donald Trump alive, he would not be alive. And I'm thankful that Donald Trump wasn't killed. Just like I would be thankful that any other political person, whether it was a Democrat, a liberal, whoever would survive. I don't want these people to be shot and killed because, number one, they're made in the image of God. Number two, the ripple effects for the society in which we live and preach and evangelize in, who knows what kind of disastrous effects they could have. We don't want to live in a country where there's political opposition being, or political people being assassinated. Remember the 60s? No, I don't, but I know very, very well about them when you had all kinds of political people being shot. The two Kennedys, and then you had Martin Luther King Jr., and there were others that were, the Texas governor was shot at, he wasn't killed, supposedly by Oswald himself too, but I don't want to live in that kind of country, and it makes, the more peaceful our country is, the better we could preach and spread the kingdom of Christ. And also, I'm glad that Donald Trump, additional reasons why he wasn't killed, because I do think he's going to be much better for the Christian cause and the moral background of the country, whatever may be said of his own personal morals. But if our expectation, a lot of the things being said are what? Well, God is with him. There's pictures of an angel stopping the bullet. People are saying, one celebrity said, when you try to stop God's angels and the saviors of the world, referring to Trump, if Trump gets in there, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that he does a lot of great things. I think he did many good things in his last presidency. He may do great things. But as I said, that only goes so far until somebody else is in there. Anyway, unless the one who sits on the throne wants very long-term effects. And that's what it goes down to. If God doesn't determine and purpose for whoever's in political office, state level, federal level, if he isn't intending for long-term good effects, then it ain't going to happen. So it's ultimately his purposes that will stand. And why would he not? Well, why did he not in Israel? The things weren't going to be good for Israel. They were going to be taken into captivity. Well, why is that? Well, it's because they were rebels. Now, the righteous among them were spared. Yeah, they did have to go into, Daniel had to go into a foreign land, and it wasn't ideal for him, right? But the point is, God's purpose stands, and we don't know God's purpose. So, we know this much, that it was by the grace and mercy of God that Donald Trump survived a quarter of an inch from a bullet's death. And that's good. That's great, and I'm thankful for that. If God did not want him alive, he wouldn't be alive. So we know that much. Now, people are saying God intervened. Did he intervene? I don't know. Intervene meaning that he had to step in some way, or otherwise the bullet would have hit Trump. I don't know that, and nobody else does, because you don't know what God is doing unless God tells you. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, it says, no man knows, let me paraphrase here, your thoughts except for you. Just like no man knows the depths of the Spirit of God except for the Spirit of God who's within him. In other words, you can't read God's mind, just like you can't read another person's mind unless he tells you. Well, we don't know what God's doing. Does God really have a purpose with Donald Trump? Oh, I don't know. So there's another aspect of this to be seen, and a biblical teaching here. And it all has to do with what is the king who sits on the throne, the real king, really doing? You know, so this perception seems to be, and I've seen other people, other atheists criticize this, that sense, if you survive like assassination or something like that, well, God must be on your side. Well, He may very well be on that person's side. He may be very well doing something with that purpose or with that person since he survived, but we don't know. We don't know what the king is doing. You know, because here's the truth of it. God can allow somebody to die and work something through that. This is the story I gave yesterday about one of the kings, King Hezekiah. Isaiah came and told him, God says you're going to die, get your house in order. And then Isaiah left. He started walking out. And then so the king was upset, didn't want to die. Of course, it was gracious of God to tell him, because everybody is going to die. And he at least got them heads up, it's going to happen. So King Hezekiah, he started praying and he was weeping and all this, and he was asking for more time. Well, as Isaiah was leaving, God said, turn around and go and tell him I'm giving him a few more years. And so it was. Well, in those years, the king had a child, and that child eventually became one of the worst kings in Israel's history. And there was a lot of judgment to come because of his influence and the things that he did. So, God was already going to have the king die. And it would have been better if God's timing, instead of the king's timing, God graciously gave him what he wanted. But we see here that if God had allowed somebody to die, it would have been better. Of course, we don't like it when somebody dies, and it's very understandable, even if it's someone close to us. But you never know, it could have been worse for us or them. You never know that. God could work a purpose by allowing somebody or having him killed. And you know what? It may even be a righteous person. I don't know that there's a better example than Jesus Christ, of course. Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And He died. That didn't indicate that He was unrighteous, did it? And it didn't show, I should have mentioned that one. That's the best example, of course. I should have mentioned that one in my program, but Jesus Christ was killed in a pretty horrible way, but that did not indicate that God, that's what they thought, right? They said, surely God has esteemed Him stricken. So they were wagging their heads. If he trusts in God, let God save him now. You see, that was the same perception that people have now, even Christians, many of them, and a lot of the political people. Well, if you survive, God's on your side, and if you don't, well, that must mean you're not. But that's not the way that it works. Even the righteous can be killed for good purposes. What better purpose than redemption of the human race through Jesus Christ's death? So someone may die. It doesn't mean that God is against you or for you in and of itself. And it doesn't mean God is not having a purpose, whatever it may be. Now, it could be that Donald Trump surviving an assassination attempt, maybe God has a purpose. But just because he survived does not tell us. I saw one critic mentioning, well, what about Abraham Lincoln? Because one of the political guys said, well, God doesn't miss. In other words, God must be doing something with Donald Trump because He doesn't miss. Well, again, He may be doing something with Donald Trump. I certainly think that between the two of them, God would favor Trump over the other because of the moral influences. But nevertheless, God's purpose I do not know. But the critic mentioned, so what about Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., the Kennedys? Well, that just falls into this perception that, well, if God allows you to die, He must be against you. But that's not the way that it is. Christians die all the time. Christians throughout history have been fed to lions, put on the wheels of torture and broken in pieces, torn apart. Christians throughout history have watched their loved ones ripped open and martyred because of their faith, burned alive. Look at the book of Hebrews. We're talking about God's people in times past. It does not, just because you die, even because you die horribly, does not mean God is not on your side. God, in fact, has a purpose. He's got a general purpose, which is to raise everybody, which He will do. In Luke chapter 13, you have this point that Jesus makes here with some some atrocities that happen with some of the Galileans. Now, there's immediate application here, but there is an abiding principle. It says in verse 1, "Now at the same time there were some present who were reporting to him about the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices." So the Galileans were offering sacrifices. Pilate and the Romans, of course, he's a Roman governor, came and slaughtered them, mixing the blood. That's how horrible this was. Mixed their blood with the sacrifices. And Jesus answered and said to them, "Do you think that these Galileans were greater sinners than all other Galileans because they suffered these things?" So you might think, well, they were especially wicked that God would allow this to happen. Isn't that the mentality? Now that's the principle. Now I think really what Jesus is talking about, well, He goes on to say, "I tell you no, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish." And I believe He means AD 70 in particular. Because both cases, I think He's saying here, if you don't fix your ways, you're going to die by the hands of the Romans too. And that's exactly what did happen. The Romans are going to come and do it to you. But the fact that they must have been worse sinners because it was a horrible kind of death, and Jesus saying, no, if you don't perish, you may not be as bad as them, but you have to repent. Now, He is saying that you got to repent here. But the principle I'm drawing from this is that you can't tell just because the fact that somebody dies or how they die exactly whether God, whether this is the wrath of God, the judgment of God, or not. Especially since the Bible tells us that even the righteous will suffer. And He goes on to say, or do you think that those 18 on whom the tower of Siloam fell and killed them were worse offenders than all men who lived in Jerusalem? I tell you no, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. No, it's just not the case. So, we can't speak more than what God has told us. And this is the other danger. If we're so sure that God must be on Trump's side, God is going to get him into the White House. Must be, because of things that have transpired. Well, I sure hope so, and that may be the case. But you know what? What if it isn't? What if he doesn't win? If people are having this mentality, the kind of religious frustration and confusion that people are going to have because they have this high expectation that God never said. God has not said these things. God has not said He's going to get him into the White House. God has not said, I've got a special purpose. God has not said He's a chosen vessel. God has not said, I'm divinely protecting him. God hasn't said these things. It may be the case, but God hasn't said, because you know what? There aren't no prophets around to tell us. And so I think these things run the risk, and they run the risk is if it doesn't happen, people are going to be pulling their hair out and say, what has God done? I have put my trust in God. Well, but God didn't say these things. And so it also gives the critics. As I was investigating, a lot of the newspapers and the political pundits and all those people were criticizing all these religious conservatives who were saying that God is with Trump. And they were saying, look, they think it's magic and all this stuff. Look at what they're doing. They're attributing these things to God. Well, they wouldn't know. They wouldn't have the position to know it themselves. They know less about God than the Christians sometimes. So they have no place. But if it doesn't turn out that God did have this special purpose, if, God forbid, Trump was attacked again and died, or if Trump doesn't win, all the critics and all the skeptics and all the atheists, in the country would say, look, see, that shows you that God was, you guys always attributing these things to God. You need to forget about God and all these kinds of things. It will give them this kind of opportunity. I don't know what God is doing or what He's doing at all with Trump or whatever. And this idea that if Trump doesn't get in there, the nation's over, or we're done. People said that about Obama. I was one of them. So if Obama gets a second term, we're done. And here we are. We're still here. So I've stopped saying these things. No, if the king decides, the one who still sits on the throne, if he decides we're done, we're done. He may assure us that we get a bad president for judgment of the country. Maybe, I don't know. He did that to Israel plenty of times. God may bring judgment. No, but what about us Christians? Why do we have to put up with the bad presidents? Well, why did Daniel have to go into captivity as a righteous man? Why did Jeremiah have to suffer? Well, God is still going to be with us, whatever it is. God hasn't promised us paradise. No, that'll be in the new heavens and the new earth. But He hadn't promised us ideal circumstances. America may not always be here. I hope that it continues. It's the best country on the planet right now. But the point is this. Isaiah saw the real king when the country didn't know what to do, didn't know what to look for because they put their trust in the wrong people. Now, I'm not saying that supporting a political person or voting for somebody, I'm not saying all these things are indication that you don't trust God. I'm saying some people do put more trust in a politician. I think we were better off when Trump was president. I think he did better things. I think he did better things for the Supreme Court. But those things can turn around pretty quick too. Look at Scalia. He was a good Supreme Court guy, and all of a sudden he's gone. And then they put a liberal one in there. These things can turn around. Your ultimate hope is not in these things because they're temporary. Our ultimate hope is in the King. That's Jesus Christ. We serve Him. And whatever happens, that should be our mindset. Yeah, we hope for the best. We hope the best people get in office, and that's what we want. We could even pray for it because we're supposed to pray for leaders and peace of the country. That's what it says in 1 Timothy chapter 2. I think it will be more peaceful for Christians when you get better politicians in office. And that's what I pray for. But if it doesn't, the King still reigns. Jesus Christ is still King. We still serve Him. We still preach the gospel. And ultimately this, when you see in Isaiah chapter 6, isn't that what it went on to say? Go and tell these people, hear, but do not see. Or preach the gospel. They will hear, but they will not understand. And that's what happens because they were stubborn. But the point is this, still preach. The best solution was that they would hear God's word and change their ways. The gospel is the best thing for the country that we could be doing. And it is our commission. Even when you know that most of them are going to put their hands over their ears, and that's what He means. Preach to the people, but they will not listen. They will hear, but they will not listen. And the reason is because when you keep telling people the truth who don't want to hear it, they dig their heels in harder. But preach nevertheless, because there are some people who change. There are some people who need to hear it, and there will be people who come and they will serve Jesus Christ. And the more that people come into His kingdom, that's the best that can happen to the country.